Hello, everybody. This is an issue refinement session for the static site editor. In today's session, I'll be refining the issue for merge request title and description, which is the new feature we want to bring in 13.5, which allows the user to specify the merge request title and description as part of the workflow of uh, editing their content using the static site editor, and as such is quite an important. It's a popular requested feature, and especially since we just use the default title and the description right now, the user is forced to go into the merge request to go and edit that, and so we want to bring that workflow closer to the user. Quickly share some mock-ups. So this is actually part of another issue, which we'll get to later, hopefully in today's session. But essentially, you'll see this modal come up asking you to provide your merge request title and description. So that's the kind of like concept. And what we want to work on today is just refining this issue. Making sure we've got all the details, identify further enhancement opportunities, iteration steps, etc. Actually already identified a feature that we, hey Chad, ignore me, I'm just talking to myself for the recording.
Hello.
So I've already identified a future feature consideration where you could potentially specify what the default title and description should be in the config, or even simpler, maybe just using the project's default. You can include a little screenshot of what that looks like, and that's currently under project settings. So that's something we could consider in the future, is to introduce or allow the user to either use the project's defaults or maybe even specify it in the config file. All right. Hey, Derek. So let's kind of like quickly go over this. So I have covered this with you already in broad strokes, so I'm just going to get into it. So the problem we want to solve is that currently when you edit a page on the static site editor, let me quickly open one and just show it. I'm just going to submit the changes. So the two challenges we're actually trying to solve is right now there's a big delay. So when we currently hit that button, it creates the branch, it creates the commit, and then it creates the MR, and it can take quite a bit of time, sometimes 30 seconds. So, but apart from that, the thing we really want to do is allow the user to specify the title and the description of the merge request as part of the workflow here, without having to go into the merge request, edit the title, edit the description. Yeah, as part of our principle of abstracting the complexity of Git workflows away from the user. But right now, we just have this ugly title, and we don't actually have any description text right now. So we want to make that better. Let me just close this because this was just for a test. Why this pipeline is being cancelled? Oh, that's not cool. Would think they would cancel the pipeline if I close the introduce. Anyway, so let's quickly have a look here. So that's just kind of like the preamble for why we want to do this feature. All right, intended users, so product managers, software developers, pretty much everybody that uses our static site editor will benefit from this. User experience goals, so the user should be able to provide additional context about the changes made that carry over into the resulting merge request. Yeah, we cover that. Proposal is when submitting a change from the static site editor, prompt the user to provide a custom merge request title and description. Current defaults should be used as placeholders. So those defaults would be kind of like that title we just saw for each of the fields, so we can retain the streamlined publishing process. Okay. So what that tells me is that if we just look at this flow again, you go into the editor, you make your changes, and then here. So as soon as you click here, that's when we want to prompt the user to kind of like provide the title. Now, excuse me. Two things we need to consider is, and I need Eric to still respond, is that the way I read this issue description kind of like was that the user would open the static site editor and make the changes. They click submit changes. The modal opens with the MR title and description pre-filled. So that would kind of like be once I click there, it would open. And the user then can choose to change the values. If we look at that modal kind of like, so they can, this would be defaulted and they could choose to change it and save, or they could close. So if the user submits, then the branch commit and MR gets created and the user is presented with the success screen. Or if they close it, the user returns to the editor state and we don't create anything. Now, we already know we have a follow-up issue where we want to decrease this wait time that we have. And so this kind of like, the nice thing about this is you can, I guess, cancel your submit action and return to the edit state without creating the branch, the commit, and the merge request. But I don't think this helps really with the speed and the wait process. So an alternative flow that I thought of is user opens the static site editor, makes the changes, click submit changes, and at this point, so when you click here, it already starts creating the branch, the commit, and the merge request, and we do it in the background, so we don't block the UI. We open the modal with the title and the description pre-filled for that we use to create the MR so long. The user then optionally changes the title and description. If they submit it, we then update the MR we created with the modified values, only if it was different, obviously, and the user is presented with success screen. Or if they close the modal, the user is presented with the success screen because there's the closing of the modal isn't a canceling in terms of creating the merge request. It's just canceling, changing the title. Now, so the key differences in the two approaches is that in the first one, you get to change your mind and say, hold on, I don't want to do this anymore. In the second one, you don't get to change your mind. The branch, you commit, and the MR gets created for you, but you do get the perceived speed improvement where we prompt you for the title and the description while creating the thing in the background. So I think these are the two kind of like approaches we need to do. Further to that, I was thinking that, like the answer to this really is what approach we need to take to achieve this issue's requirements, which is to introduce this progress bar that talks about creating the branch, creating the commit, creating the merge request. Because essentially, even without the progress bar, if we do option B that I just described, we need to prevent the user from submitting the changes until that MR is created, because like we need that MR to exist before we can update it. So this modal has a wait state. Yes, Joe?
There's a few drawbacks I see with the second approach. Like, not only is it technically more complex to have to do the multiple updates, it's also, like we said, it could create orphaned things if they abandon halfway through, or also if they rename it, like for people that are likely to want to rename every MR to be something more descriptive and perhaps the branch too, which may be a lot of people, that's going to create noise in emails because in Gmail, at least, it will thread differently because the title of the email is different. So the history of that will be threaded differently. And if this is all to reduce the perceived delay time, I think like just a progress bar is good. And if we do get the information up front, you can even say, you know, you can go ahead and close this window. The MR is going to be created in the backend for you if we offload that to some background processing. And furthermore, like there's other places like when you create an MR from an issue, there's a significant delay in that currently, and it wouldn't be any worse than that. And like I said, if we did care about it, we could offload it to background processing and let them go ahead and close the window. So I think in terms of like complexity and other trade-offs, the perceived delay, there's better ways to approach it than pre-creating everything and updating it. It's just my initial take.
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. Another potential option is I know this, basically a variation on number 2. And again, this goes back to perceived, kind of perceived performance. It would probably technically take longer, but basically what I'm thinking is if we're only allowing them to update the MR title and description, right, is we really just do the first 2 steps. That gets kicked off. The modal pops up. They're able to edit or not. And basically, it's not, you've already submitted your changes. Now it's just a matter of, do you want to, we can frame it as update, basically update your MR description or title. And then you can, or you can leave it and cancel, and either the saving that or canceling that would then actually kick off the merge request itself. So that we might be able to, just the fact that we have this interstitial UI, experience, that might basically delay the perceived length of time it takes to actually do the first 2 steps. So I don't know, that's just what comes to mind there.
Basically, do the branch and the commit creation, don't do the MR creation until the user, like
either cancels or saves the, basically, yes, we'll just leave it, or yes, I want to update it, or no, I don't, and I'll just let you do the defaults. And again, that's why I said it might technically take longer, because they could have paused at that time between the branch and commit having completed and the time they actually kick off the MR step. Again, not saying that's the best solution or anything, but I just see another variation potential.
That still allows a chance of orphaned branches because we're not doing everything atomically.
I'm missing that part. How's that the case?
So what Derek is saying is that this modal that here will actually, even if you close it, it still creates the MR just with the default values. But now my immediate reaction is that this might create a user expectation kind of like a problem, because if I dismiss a modal and I don't click submit changes, I expect things not to happen potentially. And so this is why I think that might be tricky. I always feel like at this point,
I think that can be solved. Sorry to butt in. I think that can be solved just in terms of how we frame it in the UI. Like, you've submitted the changes because you clicked submit changes button. All you're doing now is, basically qualifying what your MR is going to be. And however we frame that, as whether you close this or save it, the MR is still happening because you're submitting changes. It's just a matter of what metadata it's having because of its title or description. So, but to your point, like I can still see kind of where you're going.
I mean, should we, like, this is not in scope necessarily, but should we have an option to cancel at this point, and then delete the branch that was created?
Obviously it's something we can consider. My gut would be no. I just don't know. Have people wanted that? Like,
Yeah,
I-
that's okay.
Basically, at a high level, what I'm thinking is the way we frame the actual UI and the, you know, how we communicate through the UI can help us solve concerns is basically what I'm kind of think we can get to a point.
The question
I really
I
did like the option 2 actually, just because it is simpler. Just kick it all off and then. But Chad obviously made a great point of now it gets a bit more noisy if they actually do make the change, and now you have to update that MR. But again, I see that being kind of noisy, but I just don't know what that trade-off is.
And I'd like to, I don't know, maybe get more to the root of what is the user dissatisfaction with the delay. Like right now, they have to click a button and then they're stuck on a screen that they need to wait. And they don't want to close the window. They don't know if they can close the window. But with option A, if we get all the information up front, that's going to be immediately. And then when they submit it, then we can say, if we offload it to background processing, we can say, okay, this is done. You can now close this window, or, but is the problem that we want to redirect them to the MR and that's what they have to wait for?
No, so right now, if we look at you open the editor, you change something, you say submit changes. See, now it waits, but now this is a dead page. You know, I can't, well, I guess I can make changes here. I don't know if it's going to take it or not, probably not. But right now, I don't know if I move away, what's going to happen here. I would expect that if I navigate away that causes a page load, that will probably cancel the JavaScript that's kicking this off, and so it's going to somewhere be stuck in you know, either it might have created the branch, it might have created the commit already, but maybe at the merge request that was created. Yeah. But essentially, we want to get to the success screen that tells them kind of like, you know, this is now successfully been submitted, you know, go and view your merge request, because they need to still assign it to somebody to review and merge it.
So with, sorry to butt in, but if I can imagine with option A, this screen appears immediately, but it just doesn't have the link there, and it's got, you know, a client-side update polling for the merge request to be created. So you can either close this, or a link will appear here in a moment as soon as your merge request is created.
I agree. That's actually where my brain was too. And what would be ideal, right, is if we can at least, like, this is an optimal thought anyway, like, can we get that link to what that's going to be? Like, can we somehow generate a link? Again, that might get complex, but they could then know that that's the link they need to go to, but they're at least have confirmation. Everything's in queue. Everything's good to go. You can go do your other tasks. But if you need to come back, that's possible. But I think that does add complexity. But basically, I love that idea, Chad. That's exactly what I was thinking. Is like, we basically want to say it's in queue, it's ready, it's going. It's just taking some time. And so I think that's a great step personally.
But doesn't that introduce a lot of technical complexity to get that going? Because right now, you know, we've got 3 API promise chains that kind of like causes us to be in a loading state before we get to the success state. Now, how do we kind of like kick those things off, because they're all synchronous right now? You know,
I think it simplifies it because you're moving all of that to a single atomic background job to say sync on the back end. Through.
Yeah, you're essentially saying pass the instead of the client now making the API calls to make the branch, the commit, and the merge request, you're making a call to the backend controller to say, hey, here's the changes, persisted for me. You come to this screen, you keep polling for status or for progress, and you kind of like show it here. And when it's all done, then you show the view merge request button.
Right.
And I could see it either way. But whatever makes sense, like technically is fine. I just want to communicate. There's not going to be a problem for us to obviously just change the view and let you know that, you know, you're basically at this state, except there's, instead of being able to view the merge request button, it's loading or something, right? Like this at least gets them to the point where things are in queue. It's okay, right? Like it sounds like the main concern is like, it's okay. You're not going to cancel it if you leave. Like things are in process. It's good to go. We just don't have the link yet.
If we leave the part of the processing on the client side, they can't cancel it because we have to at least wait for the branch to be created before we can create the MR and like that. So moving, we could eliminate the perceived delay, but we can't allow them to close the window immediately unless we move the API calls to the back end, I think.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Sure. Yeah, that's if that's how we have to technically pull it off, that makes sense to me.
Which that could be a follow-on iteration, but as far as removing the perceived delay, all of the API calls could still be happening on the front end while we update the UI.
Yeah, like the simplest front end thing would basically be, we still know it's loading. We just kick you to this screen, and the loading state is no longer the submit button at the bottom. It's your view merge request button. Like that's probably the smallest incremental step to at least get you to this page to communicate that. We'd probably have to change the copy a little bit, right? To like communicate that it's like in process as opposed to completed, but maybe not.
Or spinner on the button. I don't know what the UI.
That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm referring to. Yep.
So my question is, how does all of this help us with our objective here of bringing in this the ability to edit the merge request title and description?
I'm assuming this will be after option A, where we give them a dialog to pick before we even do any API calls, the title and description with defaults.
Okay, so talk me through the flow. So you get to this state now, because option A. Wait, let's just go back. Option A.
Is that what you're thinking too, Derek?
That makes sense. From an iteration standpoint, yes, that would be the first step. I still, again, it's always the trade-off with the complexity, and obviously we want to have boring solutions. But I also see, at least right now, my vision of like the ideal situation is what you said, except we still kick off the MR, the first two pieces, because that is, there's parallel work that can be done. And then while you optionally fill out the title or description, only then do we kick off the MR. Again, that adds complexity, but that at least allows parallel work to be done. But that would be a follow-up of some kind if we went that route.
So the reason I'm leaning towards A is because it avoids the downsides of, like, if we want to give the control of the branch name as well as the MR, like we need to get all of that information up front. Otherwise, there's the possibility of an orphan branch if they abandon the MR creation, and also with the Gmail threading. If we pre-create it with the default and then we change it, and then the history is going to be spread across 2 Gmail threads.
So that might be an assumption that I misread or didn't look close enough to the mockup. Like, are we actually allowing the branch to be edited, or just the MR title and description?
So right now, the idea is only to do the MR title and description. However, there has been, I know that some users have mentioned that they would like to name their branch as well. So
I
see it as a kind of like an advanced feature, but it's definitely something that some people would like to have control over.
That makes sense. Like I was saying, if I was just solving for the title and description, that I would ideally like to kick off those first 2 processes, because you at least have parallel work while they're editing the MR title or description. But yeah, if we're going to end up having them edit the branch name anyway, then that's just a bottleneck before kicking off that process to begin with. So if we know that's coming down the pipe, we might as well kind of definitely take that into account for our solution. And knowing that, it sounds like that's where Chad's leaning much more to. So I think that makes sense.
Well, we don't know if that is coming down the pipe, because that has been 1 or 2 people who've asked for it, but it's not necessarily the majority of our users. Like, if you look at our target users, I would bet that the majority of them would not care about the branch name. Remember, we're trying to abstract away the Git workflow complexities. So the fact that you need to create a branch and choose a name for it, that's an unnecessary step for the majority of use cases.
Yeah, I would imagine the title and description is the piece that's important, right? Like, do you want to add context to what you just did is essentially what you're saying.
Yeah.
And they don't care whether that's manifests through a branch or an MR. Those are things, again, yeah, going back to your point, John, of the origins of this is we're abstracting away Git stuff. It's really about, I want to add context to this or I don't, and just go do your thing.
Yeah. Okay, so regardless, it seems like we're leaning towards the first kind of like option A, where the actual, in terms of a first step, it's basically introducing the modal in the synchronous workflow and saying, asking for the MR type, and once you click save, then we kick off the process. So let's talk about, let's quickly do that.
And that seems like the least change to the logic currently, because the API calls will remain unchanged. They're still the same promise chain and without anything added in between them.
Exactly. And then again, in iteration, if it's still a pain point, right? It adds complexity, but like we would be able to kick off the process and have some parallel amount of stuff going on. But that's downstream if we want to tackle that.
And I would like to see the feedback on whether people still have a perceived problem with the delay after this.
I agree.
Okay. I do have a question. It feels weird for me to have this submit changes, bring up a modal, and then submit changes again. I almost, like the call to action here feels like it needs to change almost. I don't know what it would.
Finished. Didn't we used to have it called finished? Or I remember some discussion somewhere of calling it finished versus submit. And then we made it all.
Yeah, so I mean, this could almost be like finished editing or save changes. I mean, we also want to think of the, like down the line, we want to have be able to resume sessions, editing sessions, and so on. So maybe save
I think
changes.
That's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, so maybe save changes, and then in the modal, it becomes submit changes. Oh, it's a bit icky.
We can iterate on that. I think that makes sense. I mean, basically, since we're introducing this new step at a high level, we need to not have a duplicate terminology communication of what actually happened.
I want to add a section for problems to solve.
Sure.
Does this have a requirement to edit the commit message as well?
No.
Okay, so the branch and the commit aren't in scope, but maybe at some point in the future. And when we do subsequent commits, if we don't let them update the commit message, then we just won't have this modal. It'll just be a save changes and it'll automatically go to the existing MR.
I believe so. I'd have to think through that again, but.
Which means there would still have to be some sort of progress indicator.
I also just want to copy our proposed workflow in here. So proposal, the current default should be, okay, so that's the proposal. Let's do this as the workflow. One, user opens the static site editor and makes changes. 2, user clicks submit changes. Modal opens with MR title and description pre-filled with default values. 4, user optionally changes the values. And then user submits values. If they submit, the branch commit and merge request gets created. And the user is presented with a success screen. Now, if they close the modal, so
those two are actually parallel. Like we should make that explicit.
What is parallel?
Like the branch getting created and the user being presented with the success screen, like they're happening synchronously.
Well, currently they are happening synchronously.
Well, in the proposal, that's what we're saying. Like the API calls will kick off and then we'll pop up the screen, but with the link not yet rendered. And that is what will eliminate the
Well,
perceived
I
wait.
think that we need to discuss in this issue, because this is the issue that deals with make the submit changes process appear faster.
Okay, different issue.
Yeah, they're
Sure.
actually two separate issues. Yeah, so I think for this specific issue, we're not going to deal with the perceived delay. We'll just deal with the actual logic flow. So one of the questions though that I do have is that if in this sequence, if I click close here, my assumption is that I get returned to the editor in the edited state that it was. So no branch, commit, or MR is created. Do you all agree with that?
I don't. I think it should be an optional, like you're submitting it and it's now do you want to, again, from a UI standpoint, do you want to add context to what you just did? There's no backing out of it.
Well,
That's how I feel about it.
Well, so that's an assumption we can make, that
Sure.
so you can either submit it with changed values. You can either submit it as is. So if we think about it this, so you click save changes or submit changes in the editor, then this comes up. Then this is already pre-filled, so you can then just say submit changes. If you don't have to change anything. So it's already ready for you to submit the changes. Ignore the fact that it's grayed out there. Just look at this last one without the progress bar. You'll just say submit changes. But if I close this modal, my assumption is that I'm not making that final commitment to save yet, and I'll return to the editor state. So I'll return to this state. And if I click here again, it brings up the modal. If I close it, it goes back here. So it's basically just closing dismissing the modal and not triggering the creation of the branch to commit in the merge request.
I see that path, and it sounds like both of you are grasping that path, and that I can totally see us that way.
Well,
the way I was thinking is we are, again, it comes down to what specific terminology do we use in the UI, but I still think that the modal itself is like we've already.
You've made a commitment then. You're saying that once you hit the
Yeah, that's true. That's true. That's true. That's true.
What I'd like to interject is, I think we need to consider this in conjunction with the reducing the perceived wait time, because reducing the perceived wait affects how this will be implemented. If this modal comes up and we don't kick off the API calls until this modal is completed, then it will work the way that you said, Jean. And we should update the UI accordingly, like with a save button, which brings up the modal, and then a create button on the modal, if that's what makes sense. But nothing happens until they do that. And then the API call happens, and synchronously the success screen is shown.
All right. I actually think the discussion we had now really shows that we need a little bit more thinking from a UX point of view on this before we commit to a technical approach. I think we can definitely take what we have right now, but we definitely have to solve the intention of the steps. Like when in the sense of, if I click submit changes here, or whatever this is called, is my intention that I'm committing to these changes? Or with the fact that I'm bringing up a modal, if I close here, do we assume you're just canceling the fact of changing the opportunity to change the title? Or, does this cancel your intention of committing to the changes? So I think that's the thing that, and I think we should kick this back to Michael and Eric to watch this recording and then give this further consideration.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, I definitely understand the concern around when you close a modal with an X, you kind of expect nothing to happen. Whereas right now, my expectation is that you're just opting out of making that edit, and it's still going to happen. So however we communicate that, but obviously that does conflict with the fact when you hit an X in a modal, you kind of expect nothing else to happen.
Right.
So
That's
that
why I
makes sense.
think what you said now seems more less intuitive to me, and also like it's not the way you would expect the modal to work. And I think it's more technically complex and has those other associated drawbacks of like, okay, these things are in a half created state.
Yeah, I think I was still, and I agree with I agree with that. Like, and as I mentioned, like that becomes it breaks expectations. I was still, I think, kind of mentally, I'm still on the side of we would have, like downstream, if we, in iteration, we kick off the 2 other steps in your last, you're just updating the fact that you're editing the MR or not. But that's not what we're solving right now. So that's, I think, just kind of where my head was.
All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you for your time. I'm going to stop the session here. I think we had some good conversation and good consideration of different opinions and intentions and stuff. And I think it's at a good point where we can give feedback to Michael to say, I need you to have a consideration of these before we take the technical planning further on this. Cool. Have a good day, both of you. Cheers.